The end of Imperial Japan's control brought a sudden and profound change to its sprawling network of naval bases. These installations, once vital to Japan's strategic dominance across the Pacific, found themselves without purpose after the surrender in August 1945. The war had shattered Japan's imperial ambitions, and with that collapse came the unceremonious cessation of the naval supremacy that had defined much of its military strategy. What had once been symbols of might and dominance became quiet, abandoned ruins, awaiting uncertain fates under the shifting tides of the post-war world. Japan's naval bases were spread across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, reaching from the Kuril Islands in the north to the remote atolls of the South Pacific. But the war had devastated both the islands themselves and the infrastructure supporting them. The cost of maintaining these bases, already astronomical before the war, had become unsustainable by the end of the conflict. By 1945, Japan's economy was in tatters. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns, culminating in the destruction of major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, had crippled the country's industrial base. The industrial sectors that had once provided the steel, machinery, and oil required to sustain the Imperial Navy now lay in ruins, unable to meet even the most basic demands of reconstruction. The immediate aftermath of the surrender saw a country in shock, struggling to comprehend its new reality. Japan had already experienced massive shortages of fuel, food, and manpower. Industrial facilities had been severely disrupted, leaving the nation without the capacity to support or rebuild its military infrastructure. The task of dismantling its naval bases was immediately complicated by the sheer scale of the operation. With hundreds of installations across the empire, no single organization or authority could handle the scope of the project alone. It was soon clear that this would be a multi-stage, multi-year effort. In some areas, the process of dismantling was carried out by the American occupying forces, while in others, the task was handed to local Japanese authorities, who were themselves still reeling from the loss of the war. The vast majority of Japan's naval bases had been constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with many expanding dramatically during the interwar period. This included enormous facilities like the Kure Naval Arsenal, one of the most advanced shipbuilding yards in the world at the time, and the Sasebo Naval Base, which played a pivotal role in the Imperial Navy's operations. These bases were not only military hubs but also integrated deeply into the Japanese economy, contributing to the production of weapons, ships, and aircraft. When the war ended, these bases, which had once supported the war effort with unparalleled logistical precision, now sat unused, haunted by their past function. The early days of occupation were characterized by an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The military was to be disbanded. The Japanese government, under the guidance of the Allied forces, was tasked with demilitarizing the nation. At the same time, the United States and its allies were already planning their own post-war strategies for the region. Japan was now a satellite of American power, and decisions about the future of its military assets would reflect the broader geopolitical shifts of the time. The first wave of changes came through immediate, often hasty, orders to render the military infrastructure unusable. This included the demolition of military facilities, the scrapping of warships, and the destruction of strategic stockpiles. At many naval bases, surplus equipment and supplies were simply abandoned. There were also orders to dismantle the naval installations themselves, with concrete bunkers and harbor facilities being reduced to rubble. In some cases, the scale of the destruction was so great that entire facilities were left to fall into disrepair, crumbling slowly over the course of the next few decades. One of the largest challenges came with the repurposing of the naval bases for civilian use. The process was not uniform, and often it was slower than anticipated. While many smaller facilities were abandoned outright, some of the larger bases were put to new uses, particularly in the growing maritime shipping industry. The Sasebo Naval Base, for instance, became a key site for post-war industrial efforts, albeit in a much more limited capacity. It was repurposed to house the fledgling Japanese merchant marine fleet, which the country needed to rebuild after the war. However, the transition was hardly seamless. The infrastructure that had once supported the Imperial Navy's warships was not easily adapted to the needs of civilian shipping. The economic pressures of post-war Japan were intense. The country was forced to rely heavily on foreign aid in the immediate aftermath of the war. The United States, as the occupying power, provided substantial support to rebuild Japan's economy. However, the limited funds available meant that rebuilding the naval bases was far from a priority. The ports and shipyards, once teeming with activity, now lay largely dormant. The Japanese government, still under occupation, was left with difficult decisions about the future of its military infrastructure. There was little hope of revitalizing the naval bases to their former glory, and the lack of available resources meant that the repurposing of many installations was limited. In the early post-war years, many bases were simply abandoned. With few resources and little strategic need for them, they fell into neglect. The Kuril Islands, for instance, which had been heavily fortified, were left largely unused. With the Soviet Union taking control of the islands after the war, there was little incentive to maintain the bases there. The same could be said for many smaller outposts across the South Pacific, where Japan's military presence had once been so dominant. These locations were often left to deteriorate, their strategic significance erased by the swift reorganization of global power. Despite these challenges, there was an ongoing debate in Japan about the future of its military assets. Some within the Japanese government argued that the country's military might eventually need to be reconstituted, given the emerging Cold War tensions. This led to the establishment of the Japan Self-Defense Forces in 1954, but this new military organization was far removed from the Imperial Navy that had once controlled the Pacific. The bases that remained were not repurposed for the same expansive naval purposes they had served in the past. Rather, they were adapted for a much smaller, defensive role, often with limited funding and resources. The ongoing presence of American military forces in Japan, particularly in Okinawa and at strategic naval bases, added another layer of complexity. These bases, built and maintained by the United States, often took precedence over the old Japanese military installations. The American military presence shaped the economic and strategic direction of the region, further diminishing the need for Japan's old naval facilities. As the Cold War took hold, the focus shifted from rebuilding Japan's own military power to securing its place as a stable, democratic ally of the United States. By the 1960s, Japan's naval bases were either obsolete or heavily repurposed. The remnants of Imperial Japan's military installations became, in many cases, relics of a bygone era. What had once been state-of-the-art facilities designed to control the Pacific had now become either empty shells or parts of a new economic landscape. The consequences of the war's end were reflected in the physical decay of these bases, as they fell silent and forgotten in the face of new geopolitical realities. Yet, the scale of this transformation remained immense. The entire process of dismantling Japan's naval infrastructure, though necessary, was never fully completed. Some sites, even decades after the war, remained frozen in time, silent reminders of the country's former imperial ambitions. The echoes of their past lives still lingered in the physical remnants that were left behind, even as Japan turned its focus toward rebuilding and redefining itself. The transformation of Japan's naval bases after the end of World War II was not simply a matter of physical destruction or repurposing. It was a reflection of the deeper shifts within the nation and its place in the post-war world. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the process of dismantling these installations continued, but it was neither clean nor complete. For many, the fate of Japan's military infrastructure during these years is a story of abandonment, repurposing, and a gradual shift in priorities as the country slowly moved toward recovery. Japan's post-war landscape was defined by the Allied occupation, which fundamentally reshaped the country's economy, society, and military capacity. The United States, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, imposed a series of policies that sought to demilitarize Japan completely. This meant not only disbanding the Imperial Army and Navy but also dismantling the very physical infrastructure that had supported the war machine. From the bombed-out remains of major cities to the remnants of naval bases scattered across the Pacific, Japan was left with little more than an economy in ruins and a nation at a crossroads. In this context, the future of Japan's naval bases was a question not just of physical space, but of national identity and survival. The American occupation authorities were the primary agents responsible for overseeing the dismantling and repurposing of Japan's naval installations. The first priority was to eliminate any remaining military infrastructure that could be used for future conflict. But there was also the question of what to do with the vast network of ports, shipyards, and military facilities that had once been the backbone of Japan's naval operations. While some of these bases were simply abandoned, others were adapted for civilian use, though this process was uneven and fraught with difficulties. Take, for example, the sprawling facilities at Yokosuka, Japan's primary naval base, located south of Tokyo. Yokosuka had once been a key site for the Imperial Navy, with dry docks capable of housing some of the largest warships in the world. After the war, the U.S. Navy took control of the base and began to use it as a major forward operating location during the Cold War. However, the Japanese had no role in this transformation. While Yokosuka remained active as a naval base under U.S. control, the Japanese government and military were excluded from any substantial involvement. As a result, the facilities at Yokosuka that had once been used to build and repair warships were repurposed for American naval needs, and Japan's own military infrastructure was relegated to a much smaller, defensive role. In contrast, the base at Kure, located near Hiroshima, faced a different fate. Kure had been one of the largest shipbuilding centers in the world, and it had played a crucial role in supplying the Imperial Navy with some of its most formidable vessels. After the war, the Japanese government faced the immense challenge of repurposing Kure's industrial facilities. The city itself had been heavily damaged during the war, and its once mighty shipyards were now largely inoperable. In the post-war years, Kure's shipbuilding industry began a slow and difficult recovery, but the scope of that recovery was far less ambitious than it had been before the war. The shipyards, now part of Japan's civilian maritime industry, struggled to adjust to the realities of the post-war economy. The need for military production had been eliminated, and instead, the shipyards began to focus on commercial vessels, though this was far from a smooth transition. The Japanese government also lacked the financial and industrial resources to support large-scale naval construction, and as a result, the legacy of Kure's naval dominance gradually faded into history. The repurposing of Japan's naval infrastructure was not limited to shipyards and dry docks. In some cases, entire naval bases were abandoned, their strategic value having been rendered obsolete. The remote islands and outposts that had once been vital to the defense of Japan were now left to decay. Many of these sites, such as those in the Kuril Islands, which had been heavily fortified during the war, were either entirely dismantled or left to fall into ruin. After the war, Japan lost control of these islands to the Soviet Union, and there was little interest in maintaining military facilities there. The Soviet Union's post-war policies in the Pacific region further diminished the strategic importance of these installations, leaving many to be abandoned, either by the Japanese or by Soviet forces. The process of abandonment was not without consequences. While many of these naval bases were left to deteriorate, they were also left with a legacy that would not be easily erased. In the case of the former Imperial Navy bases in places like Truk Lagoon, now part of the Federated States of Micronesia, the once bustling harbors and airfields became haunting reminders of Japan's wartime empire. Truk Lagoon, for example, had been one of Japan's major forward operating bases during the war, a critical hub for the Imperial Navy. After the war, however, it became a ghost town. The once thriving base was abandoned, and the remnants of Japan's military infrastructure sank into obscurity. Truk Lagoon itself became a graveyard for many of Japan's sunken ships, including warships and aircraft that were left to rust and decay beneath the surface. Despite the widespread abandonment of military facilities, some bases were repurposed for civilian use, albeit in a more limited capacity. The post-war Japanese government recognized the need for industrial reconstruction and turned some of the remaining naval installations into centers for civilian maritime industries. Ports that had once been used exclusively for military vessels were now opened to commercial shipping. The same infrastructure that had supported the Imperial Navy was now being used to support the recovery of Japan's merchant fleet, which had been decimated during the war. However, This transition was not without difficulties. Many of the industrial facilities at naval bases like Kure were too damaged to be immediately useful. Shipyards that had once churned out battleships and aircraft carriers now struggled to produce even basic commercial vessels. The repurposing of military infrastructure was hampered by limited resources, and the Japanese government had to prioritize rebuilding efforts elsewhere. The naval bases, once centers of military might, now represented a painful reminder of Japan's lost war effort. By the 1950s, the U.S. presence in Japan was a fixture of the Cold War. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated, Japan found itself in the uncomfortable position of relying on American military support. The self-defense forces that Japan had established in 1954 were designed to ensure the country could defend itself, but they were a far cry from the naval power that had once been at the core of Japan's military strategy. The old naval bases, once integral to Japan's imperial ambitions, were now viewed as relics, their purpose either entirely erased or reduced to a defensive role. The Japanese government had few resources to devote to the restoration or modernization of these bases. The shift from militarism to a focus on economic recovery left the old naval infrastructure to rust and deteriorate. By the time Japan's economy began to recover in the 1960s, the need for large naval bases had diminished. The country's reliance on the United States for defense and its newfound economic strength shifted its focus to other priorities, such as rebuilding the industrial base and developing its technological and manufacturing sectors.